Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast that explores how to create meaningful art experiences in the built environment. I'm your host, Martha Weidman, CEO and co-founder of 9.Arts, and I'm excited to have Juan Alonso-Rodríguez, an artist, as our guest on the show today. He talks about community, representation, and his latest installation at 23rd and Union in the Central District, an image of hollyhocks that shows symbols of resilience in a neighborhood that's been through so much change. You can check out Juan Alonso's work on his website, juanalonsostudio.com. If you haven't already, a reminder to check out our State of the Art report. That's where we bring all of these stories to life in numbers. This report provides insights into the impact of art in our built environment and art in community. So check out that report, stay tuned, and enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast, where we explore art, culture, creativity, and how those can impact our community and the built environment. Today we have a unique guest on our show, Juan Alonso-Rodríguez, who is an artist of many types. He's a painter, he does drawing, photography, sculpture, and I just learned that he's actually a musician as well, a singer. So I'm really excited to have this creative mind on our show today. Juan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell our listeners a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and why it matters.
So I consider myself a visual artist primarily. I did do music, but it's been a while since I made that my primary focus. Um, I do work in my studio, and I also do public projects, which often involves large-scale sculpture or any other type of treatment that requires the right materials for outdoors. Um, I also consider myself an activist. I'm very pro advancing artists and the arts and culture. So I've been very involved in the community since I started making work here in Seattle, where I'm located, since about 1984.
So what are you working on right now, Juan, that you're excited about? What's happening next for you?
A few things are happening right now. I am getting ready to install I guess it's a private project, but it's in a public space. I'm going to be installing 4 stainless steel sculptures outside on a wall outside a building that's being built right now in the Central District in Seattle. Hopefully it'll be installed by next Thursday. So I'm looking forward to seeing it up. Besides that, I have a bunch of paintings in my studio that I've started priming so that I can get going as soon as that's dry. I always have several things going on at once because it's you don't want to sit and watch the paint dry. You have to have other things in process as well.
So for our listeners who, might come from the world of architecture or real estate or other forms of art making or creativity, could you shed some light on the public art process and how you use art to tie into a community and tell a story? And would love to even hear that detail from a broad level and specifically around the project that you were describing that's going to install on Thursday.
The public art process is a really interesting one, and I actually got the opportunity to not only serve on the Seattle Arts Commission, but one of the committee that I was really interested in serving on was the Public Art Advisory Committee. And I always want to see both sides of the process. I've seen it from the artist's point of view, but I wanted to know what was on the other side. Like, what is it like to accept a project or reject a project or critique a project to make it work better for both the client and the artist. So to me, it's a collaboration. It has to be a collaboration. One of the things that I think about is the audience. Who is receiving this work? I mean, they don't necessarily own it, but they're receiving it. They're living with it. They're walking by it on a daily basis. So how is it affecting the specific community where this is going to be placed? And what are you doing to address that? So just to give you an example, this particular artwork that I'm installing next week, it's a sculpture called Hollyhocks. Um, so one of the things that I started taking into consideration when I applied to create work for this project is so as we're probably all very familiar with redlining. So this has happened in most cities throughout the country. So in Seattle, the central district was a redlined district. So they were, and it's gone through a lot of changes. It was for a long time, it was a lot of Jewish people that lived in the central district. It's also historically a very Black community, and with gentrification, that has started to change. So I love the fact that the builders wanted to include a lot of artwork into the building, and they didn't have to, but it was something that they felt was important, especially with the gentrification and the displacement of a lot of people that were living in that particular area. So one of the one of the things that I had to take into consideration is that there was going to be this beautiful sculpture by a very renowned sculptor who is now passed on, James Washington Jr. And it was going to be placed very close to where my artwork was going to be placed. So you have to take into consideration that you don't want to compete, you don't want to clash, you want to sort of get a little bit of feedback from what's going to be in your surroundings, right? So this sculpture is these salmon that are jumping over these rocks. And so I wanted to make it to have it be organic, but I didn't want to do fish because that would have been a little bit redundant. So okay, what can I do that's living, that's sort of from this area? So I started thinking, well, I've always loved botanical imagery. So what can I find? What sort of botanical imagery can I find that is going to speak to specifically a certain audience, and it's going to speak to specifically to the idea that this was a red line district, that this was a neglected district. So I started doing research on plants that are native to this area or that grow very well in this area. And I remember the first house that I moved into when I first moved to Seattle in 1982 was full of hollyhocks. And I thought I had never had never seen hollyhocks coming from Florida, Cuba, and very tropical climates. And I also remembered that when I went to the James Washington Jr. home, there were hollyhocks all over his home. And then I started doing even more research about how hollyhocks grow in very neglected soil. So I thought it was such a statement on resilience and on something that, it's neglected and yet it's going to stand, it's going to be there. And I thought that that was a great metaphor for what's happening to the Black community in the Central District, that no, we're still here. We're still part of this neighborhood. And I wanted that to really resonate with what was going on. And so you have to really think ahead and know that you're doing something for an audience.
It's a beautiful tribute, not only to the neighborhood, but to the other artists that are a part of this this public impact, this public benefit that's for the neighborhood and for the community, as you mentioned. I think it's worth taking a moment to inform our listeners a little bit about the specifics of this project and this structure and how that's different from the percent for art policies. So you mentioned earlier, right? These are the developers choosing to have art as a part of their project for some specific reasons. Probably, who knows? And it'd be great to hear your perspective on why you think this is important. And then there's private funds, private development choosing to have art as part of their projects. And then there are city funds, the municipal dollars, the Percent for Art program, which was established in the 70s in Seattle, one of the first programs of its kind in the country. And they are two different ways of doing things. One is with city funds, one is with private funds. Both can have some really impactful um, installations for the community. And I'm curious to know if someone who sat at the table from different angles, what do you think the public art, the municipal, the cities can learn from what private developers are doing? And what do you think private developers can learn from what the city is doing and from an artist perspective?
I think with the 1%, I mean, it's a little obviously it's a little bit more bureaucratic because you have to think that you're spending a whole lot of people's money. You're spending taxpayer money. So I loved being on the Public Art Advisory Committee because I took it very seriously. I took it as this is a big responsibility. I am helping spend everyone's money. And I want to make sure that, at least for the time that I am serving on this committee, that the money spent on art is spent well, and that the artist making the art is as comfortable as possible and as well assisted as possible, so that the work created is as good as it's going to get. Um, you have a lot of things to consider. I mean, there's all the public things that you need to think about, um, rights of way, all kinds of things that you wouldn't even think at first that you needed to consider. But they're there for a reason. Like, I had to make sure that, for one particular piece, that the height of a person who was blind, so that they wouldn't, if they were walking by the sculpture, that they could tap with a cane and make sure that they were not going to hit their head at any point. So all these little things you have to consider. Um, there's also usually a set budget because it's 1% of what the cost of the building was. So you have to adjust whatever your idea is to what you can do with that amount of money. And a lot of times, you can with a private project, it's a little bit easier to say, hey, I could do this if I had a little bit more. In fact, like, these hollyhocks are now going to be a little bit larger than they were originally, but it was working with the developer. With the public project, it's really not as flexible to increase a budget because it's pretty much set, by the cost of the building. I think that, I think that the 1% could learn a little bit from the private enterprise, uh, by perhaps being a little bit more flexible, and having a little bit more of a sort of buffer, so that in case there is the opportunity to create something really great as opposed to just great, that it can be done. I think that, private, I don't know that there's anything in particular that private developers can learn, except for there's a lot of I's dotted and T's crossed by the 1% for art projects. So I have done some work for private developers that have been a little bit loosey goosey, where, like, okay, no, I really want you to pay more attention to the details. We both need to do that. So I think there is a give and take. And I would love to see public-private projects. I think that there is a space for that, and it's just a matter of having people at the forefront or of arts organizations in the cities, counties, and states, and developers that are flexible enough or that are willing enough to work with, uh, government entities.
Interesting to have that perspective. And you talked a little bit about, the sometimes in the private entities being able to work with a developer, and of course in the project that you were describing, there's an art consultant involved too. And Vivian Phillips was helping to guide this, if I understand correctly, the project that you're working on. So tell the listeners a little bit about that experience and how having an art consultant on board is able to streamline that process or develop the narrative, and what role they played, because it's almost as if she's filling some of those parts that perhaps the city might do in the public art program in other ways.
It's been fantastic working with Vivian. I mean, she's amazing. She's genius material. But I think that she is a liaison, and I think she is also a translator, because I I come to this as an artist, and this is my idea. This is what I want to see, and it's up to the developer to say, well, it's up to the curator to say, yes, this is acceptable. And there was a committee of people that selected the work. It wasn't just Vivian. So she got this group of people together to help with selecting the artwork. So that's already one job that she's doing. But right now, even arranging installation, my go-to is her. Like, I tell her, this is what's happening. Let's arrange installation, and then she will talk to the developers to make sure that we're all coordinating everything all at the same time, and that it flows very smoothly. Uh, Also, when I have worked for and I have created a couple of pieces for the Washington State Arts Commission, I had project managers as well, which have been lifesavers. I worked in a project with Laura Elizabeth Becker, who she's moved on to another organization, but it was it was such a difficult project at first, and had it not been for her, I don't know that I would have remained on the project. She just really stood up and kind of said, like, I'm going to make this happen with you. And and not every project is difficult. I mean, every project is stressful in a way, because you're creating something that's going to be around forever, and people are going to see it, and you're putting your work on the line. But this particular project was a little bit difficult at first, and had it not been for her, I don't know if I would have kind of continued on with it.
Yeah, the value of a great project manager, a great support system to help you through that process is key. As you were speaking earlier, you were talking about the smart developers are utilizing art and culture as a way to activate spaces, to build social impact and amplify their communities. From your experience, what are the benefits of a thoughtful art and culture plan? And are there special moments of impact that come to mind when you think about an art experience that maybe you've been involved in or seen and experienced yourself?
Whatever your neighborhood is, whatever your community is, you want to feel good about walking out your door. You want to feel that sense of comfort and sense of home. And I think what developers are kind of getting the idea is that, yes, this is important. When I think I briefly mentioned this before. When you visit another city, um, now there are many things that you can like about visiting another city, and there's maybe you like their sports team, maybe you like their type of government, maybe you like their politics, maybe all of those things are great. But I think a lot of times we go to, okay, what's a beautiful area? What is the area that's going to make me feel the best? That's going to make it inviting for me to go in there and to sit outside and have a glass of wine at a cafe, or have a cup of coffee in the morning looking at this beautiful view, looking at, overlooking a park which has been designed by an artistic person. Why is this particular neighborhood hot? Why does everyone want to move to this neighborhood? Oh, because it has the amenities that make people want to live there. It has, sure, we all want restaurants, we want bars, we want a grocery store, all those really useful things. But even when it comes to a restaurant or a bar, you want it to be inviting.
Well, I feel like so many of those terms you were describing really describe placemaking and things that make a great city. And that's a concept that a lot of developers and organizations like the Urban Land Institute and planners have really tapped into now. Creative placemaking, cultural placemaking. For you, what does that mean? And what role does art play in this big concept of placemaking on a citywide scale?
I think it becomes this collaboration. I think it becomes a collaboration between visual art, performance, music, culture. Uh, I think a lot of places right now are thinking about how do we get together. Uh, okay, so we're building this new development, this new park. Maybe it's a public park, or is it like the waterfront right now that's being worked on. How do we make it comfortable so that everyone, no matter what your background is, no matter where you're coming from, is going to feel comfortable attending an event there? It's going to feel comfortable having a picnic. You want to be able to be welcoming. So you have to be mindful about the fact that we live in a very multicultural society, which is fantastic, because to me, the more you learn about other people's culture, the more enriched you are. So you want to bring in those folks. You want them to look at artwork that's not just from one particular part of the world. You want to see the richness that so many people bring into, bring to the table to add to your enrichment. So you want visual art that's welcoming to as many people as possible. You want to create spaces that are optimal for entertainment, music, or somebody wants to put on a public play, or just for an area where people can come and you know make a meal and have a get together, a family reunion, or something like that. It's I think we think a lot about it as two separate things, and the fact that is that culture and art is this really intertwined collaboration that we've been living with. I think we're not quite aware of how much we've been living with it, and how much we crave it.
Absence is its presence in so many ways.
Absolutely. And I think people don't talk about it as much because we are so used to art and culture being around us. I remember when the pandemic first started and everybody was kind of looking for art, looking for new music. Nobody's making new movies. And people were complaining about this. Oh, I know you're complaining because you're used to having it.
Well, if you have some developers, there are developers in the audience. So, do you have any advice for them? Maybe even just empirical or technical advice on things like when they should start thinking about art collection or an art plan, who should be involved, how much they should allocate in the budget. Do you have any advice for our listeners in that regard?
Absolutely. When you're thinking about a development, that's when you bring the artists in. Because look, I think there maybe it's just my personal passion, but I think architecture and art go very hand in hand. And I think to have uh, not just, I mean, and it doesn't have to be just a visual artist, but to have an artist at the table when you're being creative. I mean, even if you don't necessarily want them to give you input as to what they want you to do, but just to have that creative feedback, like what's missing here? What can how can I make this better? What can you contribute that's going to make me just come up with this amazing development.
Are you seeing any trends in art, architecture, and placemaking that you think will impact the way that you work?
There was a time when a lot of the 1% for art was, I think the builders just wanted a little bit of artist input, or they wanted something that sort of went to the background, and you barely noticed that it was there. And that was actually one of my complaints a long time ago, because I thought, I want to make art that I want people to know that it is art. I don't want them to think that it is part of the architectural um, drawing, and I wanted to stand out. I think that that trend has gone the other way, which I love, and that people are thinking about what is it going to be, what is the experience going to be once there are people living there.
And could you tell us about a piece of artwork or a personal art experience that you've had that made an impression on you or was especially memorable?
I can I know exactly what I want to tell you about. Um, so if I had to pick one artist that I absolutely love, that probably supersedes every other artist, is Wilfredo Lam, and he's a Cuban-born artist who was a contemporary of Picasso. But so he is Cuban-born, comes from his parents. One of his parents was Chinese, and the other African. So that was their background, and then here they are together, and then he's born in Cuba. He doesn't really make it big until he moves to Paris, and meets up with all these other amazing artists. So I've always loved his work. I really liked it, and I always saw it in books. The first time that I saw one of his works was in San Francisco. So in 2011, I got to go back to Cuba, and this was 45 years after I left. And one of the things, of course, I wanted to go to the museums. And so my family and I went to this one museum, and they had a very large room full of very large Wilfredo Lam artworks. And I I went into that room, and I lost my breath. I I thought, this is just stunning. And I remember telling my family, who had been like walking around Havana this whole time, and I said, could you please walk outside? I just really want to be in this room by myself. And I was in this room, and I sat on the bench in the middle of the room full of his work, and I cried. And it was just an amazing experience, because it just, I finally got to see enough of his work that it was so intense. It was so emotional. And I think that's probably my most memorable museum visit ever.
That's a beautiful story. My friends and I have a phrase when we get to be in work that really moves us on our own. It's almost a spiritual experience, and we call it art church.
Absolutely. And I had one of those when I went to La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Um, I am not a religious person, but I wanted to see this church. And I walked in there, and I felt that. I felt like, okay, this is what my friends who are religious talk about, because it was that kind of experience.
Well, one is I love hearing the perspective coming from an artist. It's really a unique one to have on the show and an incredibly important one for the built environment overall and a great voice to have at the table. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with me and our listeners that we haven't discussed today?
But I don't know if there's anything else. But keep including artists. Keep us at the table. Uh, I think that people think that art is something that you have to do professionally. Um, I think art is something that everybody should keep on their minds, because it helps with other issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis. I think the idea that I mean, kids have to be taught certain things, math, how to write and writing, spelling, and all that stuff. I think we think of art as this optional thing. I think if we include art in education like all the time as like a necessity, I think students would do a lot better on a lot of other subjects because it helps you solve problems.
Juan, thank you so much for being on the show today. Where can our listeners learn more about you and your work? What's the best way for them to find you?
I keep a website. It's always very up to date. It's juanalonsostudio.com.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Your story is super inspiring, and I cannot wait to experience the Hollyhocks in real life.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
All right. Thanks, Juan. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of ... And to keep up with our latest episodes, be sure you subscribe to 9.Arts on YouTube or search ... wherever you get your podcasts. Looking for an art consultant to transform your next project? Email us. Let's talk at 9.arts.com. Until next time, on behalf of everyone at 9.Arts, here's wishing you some inspiring art experiences.